The banks of the Lower Rhine, close to the Dutch-German border, are home to a unique natural landscape, the Düffel. Only a second, closer look reveals the uniqueness of the Düffel. This traditional farming region is home to numerous rare species of meadow and wading bird. Their survival is dependent on a very particular meadow habitat. They need untouched wetlands and pastures in order to feed and protect their young.
Wir befinden uns hier im Naturschutzgebiet.
We're in the Düffel Nature Reserve. It's a designated bird sanctuary in the Lower Rhine region. The conservation area is 3,800 hectares in size. Of these, we, the NABU-Nature Protection Center, manage around 140 hectares of publicly owned land. We're most directly concerned with the meadow birds native to the region. Their numbers have been decreasing drastically over the past few decades. In the 1970s, there were still around 70 pairs of black-tailed Godwits living in the Düffel. Since then, this number has dropped dramatically. So urgent action is needed to reverse this trend.
Many meadow birds are on the International Red List of endangered species as their numbers are declining worldwide. To help stop this sharp decline, the EU member states have designated special bird sanctuaries for those species they are responsible for. One of these sanctuaries is here, on the banks of the Lower Rhine. To protect the endangered meadow birds of the Düffel, the NABU-Naturschutzstation Lower Rhine is running a conservation project entitled Grassland for Meadow Birds. This involves closely monitoring the bird population, understanding the needs of the individual species, and taking active measures to protect them. Yet there is an unavoidable conflict at play. This is a region that is rich in biodiversity, yet at the same time, intensively farmed. Leaving behind their wintering grounds in Africa and the Mediterranean, in summer the birds return to the Lower Rhine to breed.
Wow, okay.
The meadow landscape was created by human settlers who first cultivated this land. But in recent decades, human activity has caused a deterioration in the living conditions of many animals here. The traditional farming region with its abundance of grassland has been a conservation area since 1987. It covers around 3,800 hectares, 140 of which belong to the state. There are rules that regulate in which way the land may be used for farming, and there are also several hectares of land where contracts are signed with local farmers on a voluntary basis. They agree to farm the land in a way that protects the wildlife. Meadows that are still covered in water by early summer cannot be farmed efficiently. Yet for the bird population, this habitat is essential for their survival. Intensive farming is one of the challenges faced by bird species across the Düffel. One highly endangered species that is native to these shallow waters is the black-tailed Godwit. The most important thing for the meadow birds is the water balance. They need moist ground where the topsoil remains wet until June. These birds poke around in the soil with their long beaks looking for insects and worms. And if the ground gets too hard, as it does here when the meadowland dries out, it's very important that the soil retains enough water until June. First, we took care of the ponds that were already here on this area of public land. We created new habitats for the birds with much shallower shores. The water slowly recedes during the spring, leaving open topsoil where the black-tailed godwit and other wading birds can dig for food. These muddy areas gradually take over the entire pond area as the water recedes towards the center.
Our main goal is to protect our target species, the black-tailed Godwit, Redshank, Lapwing, Eurasian Curlew, and common Snipe. We call them our Big Five. We're focused on these species in particular because their numbers have decreased dramatically in recent decades. There are different reasons for this, one of which, of course, is that agriculture has also changed. Farming has become more intense. The meadows are being mowed earlier. The land was partially drained and dried out. There are also other factors involved, like climate change, for example. We have heavier rainfall, but also months of drought. Both extremes have really increased.
Throughout history, the River Rhine has defined this landscape, and it has been a major trade route for thousands of years. The once wild river originally flowed in countless loops and tributaries towards the North Sea coast. After the Ice Age, swampy floodplains were formed along its banks, which the river regularly flooded. Willows and poplars are typical trees for forests found along riverbanks. These trees often get wet feet due to the frequent flooding. With every flood, the river changed its own bed and banks. It created gravel banks and new islands by washing the existing banks away and depositing the sand somewhere else. Particularly high tides flooded the adjacent woodlands and caused the groundwater level to rise. When the river retreated again, small puddles and mud were left behind. This provided water and food for many species of plant and animal. Regular flooding also made the land here extremely fertile, which led humans early on to settle on the higher banks of the river. The settlers gradually cleared the forests, dug ditches to drain the land, and created a landscape suited to farming. By then, the birds lived in the open landscape. Prior to this, their natural habitat had been the swampy ground of the wetlands. Today, the Rhine is the busiest waterway in Europe. The river's natural course was tamed by man and forced to flow between fortified banks over a fixed riverbed. To make the winding river navigable for larger vessels, its banks were straightened and the riverbed was deepened. Yet these measures have cut the Rhine off from its surrounding pastures. They are causing groundwater levels to fall and the wetlands to disappear. Industrialization and infrastructure are driving the wildlife from its natural habitat. The main goal of the Grassland for Meadow Birds project is to create, support and protect a wildlife refuge with sustainable living conditions for the meadow birds. Meadow birds build their nests and breed on the ground. They need a habitat rich in flora to provide the necessary food and protection for their young. The birds build their nests in small hollows in the center of the meadow, where they quietly lay their well-camouflaged eggs. Both parents care for their young. For about 4 weeks, they take turns incubating their eggs by sitting on them. This is known as brooding. Farming the fields and meadows during this time poses an acute danger to the baby chicks that are still gestating inside the eggs. That's why farming in the specially designated bird habitats only takes place once the brooding period is over. All farming activities are on hold at the moment. The ground can't be farmed again until the black-tailed Godwit and other wading birds have finished brooding. Usually this is agreed between the farmers and ourselves directly. There's a fixed date in the contract, but once our mapping shows that the birds have stopped brooding, we can approve that farming resumes. These extensively farmed areas of marshland and meadow are a refuge for the birds. But the biologists can only take protective measures, especially when it comes to maintaining the water balance, on areas of land that actually belong to the Nature Project. Meadows have a much richer ecosystem. The cows eat around the plants that can protect themselves, whether through poison or thorns. They avoid these kinds of plants, and so they continue to grow, which provides a refuge for the young birds. And once everything else has been mowed, any plants that remain provide a home for insects that the birds can then feed on. The water here is both a blessing and a curse. In the past, before the high embankments were built, this grassland was regularly and dramatically flooded. Many of the old buildings are perched on mounds of earth, like small castles. These hills, called polds by the locals, elevated the buildings above potential floodwaters. The old church in Niel still bears testament to the flood damage of centuries past. Although it was built several meters above the fields and meadows, it was regularly hit by tidal waves from the river. This posed an existential threat for the inhabitants of this agricultural region. The strength of the tides forced the farmers to tame the river in order to protect their livelihoods. They dug ditches around the fields to drain the water and built ever higher embankments. Over the centuries, they managed to fight back against the floodwaters that threatened their survival. Nowadays, behind the embankments, large agricultural companies are intensively farming the land. Man has bent nature to his will and industrialized the landscape.
We have wide, flat land here, a lot of nature, but there's also intensive farming. This is very good soil, heavy soil, with high yields. 80 ground points, which is about the best you can get. The grassland areas are fertilized differently. We use mineral fertilizer here, in accordance with procedures, of course. The cows produce milk, and we live from the profits.
Seiten der Landwirtschaft und Naturschutz.
The problem is that farming and conservation are rarely compatible. They are clearly in conflict. Farmers need land to operate their businesses, and conservationists need land to protect nature.
Wir brauchen Flächen für ihren Naturschutz. Ganz klar.
Die Situation zwischen Landwirtschaft und Naturschutz.
The conflict between farming and conservation in the Kleve region has no obvious solution. Intensive farming has had a huge impact on the meadow birds, on their breeding populations. Depending on what kind of farming methods are practiced, whether pesticides or mineral fertilizers are used, or if manure is spread on the soil, none of this is good for biodiversity. For the land to be managed successfully, we need mowing to start later and farming to be put on hold at critical times.
This is the period from March to the end of May when the ground needs to be moist so that the adult birds can find the food they need. This heavily fertilized meadow is now covered in fast-growing grasses, which are pushing out the slower-growing herbs. This is an efficient way to grow food, as the grass can be mowed several times a year. Yet the financial incentives to farm the land in a way that also protects the wildlife are usually not sufficient. New agricultural policies are urgently needed to solve this problem.
Auch die Wiese haben wir gerne.
This meadow is also very important to us. The hay has a particular smell. A delicious smell, you could say.
Sag ich mal so, die Kuh frisst.
The cows love to eat it.
Dieses Heu ist auch nicht.
But there aren't huge amounts of it, so it doesn't yield enough for us to live on.
Wie gesagt, da können wir nicht von leben. Ne?
The birds settle here due to the large numbers of insects. But the fewer flowers there are, the less food there is for the birds. A simple matter of cause and effect.
Wir werden hier im Live-Projekt Grünland.
One of our goals in the Grassland for Meadow Birds project is to buy more land, particularly in the so-called focus areas here in the Düffel. We plan to buy land or exchange land and farm it in a way that protects the interests of the bird population.
We started out by using rescue methods on the areas of land that already belong to the conservation project. We irrigated the ground with fresh water. We will steadily improve these methods once we have a large enough area of adjoining land where we can dig small trenches. This will ensure that the water or the wet soil will stay on the surface well into the springtime and provide the moist conditions that the meadow birds need. This flat pond is now a popular playground for the birds, and not only for the big five that are the focus of this conservation project. For many other wader species and water birds, this area of land provides an urgently needed habitat in otherwise dried out wetlands. On this created shallow pond in the middle of the nature reserve, the birds can feast on midges, insect larvae and worms. They have plenty of space to sleep and to bathe themselves and to take care of their young. Many species migrate south to warmer climates during the winter and return to the Lower Rhine for the breeding season. They have just 3 months to get their young fit and strong enough for the journey south. This requires a lot of energy and therefore a lot of food. A little ringed plover has found a spot to brood its eggs right next to the pond. The muddy soil below contains an abundance of snails and insect larvae for it to feast on. The meadow and wading birds all have to brave the unpleasant weather typical of the season. Extreme weather is becoming more common, with longer periods of extended rain and severe drought. Both prevent the chicks from getting the nutrition they require. It is an energy-consuming and also a dangerous time for them. In May, the female plover laid 4 nondescript-looking eggs in a small nest on top of some pebbles. Often the nesting birds are disturbed or even threatened. This time a young hare has got too close to the nest and is quickly chased off. The ground-breeding birds are always alert to surrounding threats. For these birds, diversionary tactics and even counterattacks are part of the day-to-day life of being a parent. Thankfully, the nosy young hare didn't pose a significant threat. Pairs of black-tailed Godwits also return to the familiar meadowlands in breeding season. They often brood their eggs just a few meters away from their earlier breeding grounds. The male bird creates several nests which it cushions with blades of grass and other parts of plants. The female then chooses the location for brooding. Here in the long grass, the animals are perfectly camouflaged. They usually brood in small groups together with other wading birds. This provides safety in numbers and allows them to better protect their nests. Hidden by thousands of undulating blades of grass, the black-tailed godwits are hard for predators to see. Even when a godwit extends its long neck out of the grass to keep an eye on its surroundings and react quickly if necessary, it remains well concealed. Protecting this essential habitat is a key task for the conservationists.
We're very happy with the results. Last year, we had some lapwings. The black-tailed godwits and redshanks also settle here with their chicks at the shallow ponds that we've created especially for the birds. And so far, it's been a great success.
A small colony of lapwings is brooding here. Despite the prime location, they have to be vigilant because their eggs are in constant danger. Like the godwits, they mostly brood in small groups together with other wading birds, so they can better protect their nests. Lapwings are masters of distraction. As soon as predators approach the nest, the birds engage in collaborative air defense. Birds from nearby nests also join in to fight off the intruder, aiming to distract, unnerve, and confuse the enemy. Meadow birds avoid tall plants. The surrounding foliage needs to be very low-growing, very open, because from the perspective of a godwit, there could always be a predator, either a bird or a mammal, lurking nearby that poses an immediate threat to its brood. It's also important to have a large enough space, because the further apart the birds can keep their eggs, the harder it is for a fox, for example, to steal all of them. Some of the eggs would probably go unnoticed and therefore unharmed, which may be sufficient to maintain the population. If we only created one small area for the godwits to brood, and they were all forced to brood close together, a fox could attack and steal all the eggs in a single night. Here, maintaining the landscape also means pruning the hedgerows. In just a few years, hedges and bushes can become overgrown, creating an unruly thicket where the birds' natural predators can easily hide. Overgrown bushes have to be pruned back regularly. They are cut back to around 1 meter in height, which also allows them to flower nicely. That way, in subsequent years, we will have hedgerows that are rich in blossoms, which will provide a lot of food for the birds that nest inside them. The lapwing's elaborate air defense maneuvers are often successful. After 4 weeks, it's time for the chicks to hatch. Yet only a handful of them survive for longer than a year. In the past, the lapwings would brood in marshlands and wet areas. Their eggs were even considered a delicacy. These days, as the low-growing open grassland that the lapwings prefer is increasingly hard to find, they often settle in fields instead. Yet the fields lack sufficient sources of food, and the young birds frequently starve. Or they fall victim to agricultural machinery and birds of prey. The meadowbird's chicks leave the nest only a few hours after hatching, following the call of the adults. They must then venture out and find their own food. The vegetation and abundance of flowers are ideal for the still fragile baby lapwings. It protects them from the view of predators and contains food that is rich in energy. Time is short. In just a few weeks, they will be fully fledged and must be strong enough for their first long-distance flight.
Die Wiesenvögel kommen im März.
The meadow birds come in March and stay until June. By June, the brooding period is over, but the chicks are still following their parents. Between March and early May is when the birds, especially the females, have to eat a lot themselves. After that, they mostly feed on insects from the flower-rich grassland.
Vor allem auch Insekten aus dem blütenreichen Grünland.
The mother bird leads her chicks down to the water's edge. To grow quickly, the young birds have to eat thousands of insects every day. For the first few weeks, they mostly eat small insects, just millimeters in length, which they find in the meadow and on the water. If they don't find enough insects, the parents and their chicks will walk for kilometers to find a better source of food. But this can be risky, increasing their chances of being killed by traffic or falling prey to thieves. For the first few days, the chicks have difficulty regulating their body temperature. If they're not careful, the cold will kill them. The mother bird has to keep calling her babies over and try to keep them warm under her wing. In the autumn, the meadow birds fly thousands of kilometers, often without stopping, over the Mediterranean towards Africa. When the meadow birds have left for the winter, flocks of geese arrive in the Düffel, having flown in from the north. Each year, around 180,000 wild geese spend the winter between Duisburg and the Dutch border, and the Düffel is one of their traditional wintering hotspots, so to speak. The Arctic wild geese have come from their breeding grounds in Siberia. Their wintering ground is here on the Lower Rhine. In the evening, they gather in their thousands and fly together to their sleeping waters, where they spend the night protected by their sheer numbers. The conservationists regularly count and map the birds in the Düffel.
Es gibt kein ökologisches Gleichgewicht.
There's no ecological balance. The world is constantly changing. Even thousands of years ago, there were species dying out. New species will also come into existence. At the moment, though, things are changing too rapidly, and the species that are currently threatened aren't getting a chance to recover.
From my perspective, the project would be a success if we managed to at least stabilise the population. Even that is difficult. But if enough Godwit chicks survive in the Düffel each year so that we can simply maintain the population numbers, then that in itself would be a huge success.
I hope that in 10, 20 or 30 years, we will be working even more closely together with the farming industry and also with the local population, so that we can maintain the positive trend that we're seeing here today. Other projects in Europe have shown us that it is possible. I believe in our work and that it will make a difference.
The meadow birds in the Düffel are a reliable indicator for the biodiversity of this landscape. But what is it worth for us to protect them? If we truly want to preserve this biodiversity, we must act fast to protect this landscape, for both man and nature.